Welcome back to another day of reading Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. Today we're reading Volume 2, Chapters 2 and 3. About 12 o'clock that night was born the Catherine you saw at Wuthering Heights, a puny 7-month child. And 2 hours after the mother died, having never recovered sufficient consciousness to miss Heathcliff or know Edgar. The latter distraction at his bereavement is a subject too painful to be dwelt on. Its after effects showed how deep the sorrow sunk. A great addition in my eyes was his being left without an heir. I bemoaned that as I gazed on the feeble orphan, and I mentally abused old Linton for what was only natural partiality, thus securing his estate to his own daughter instead of his son's. An unwelcomed infant it was, poor thing. It must have wailed out of life, and nobody cared a morsel during the first hours of existence. Redeemed the neglect afterwards, but its beginning was as friendless as its end is likely to be. Next morning, bright and cheerful, out of doors stole softened in through the blinds of the silent room, and suffused the couch and its occupant with a mellow, tender glow. Edgar Linton had his head laid on the pillow and his eyes shut. His young and fair features were almost as death-like as those of the form beside him, and almost as fixed, but his was the hush of exhausted anguish, and hers of perfect peace. Her brow smoothed, her eyes closed, her lips wearing the expression of a smile. No angel in heaven could be more beautiful than she appeared, and I partook on the infinite calm in which she lay. My mind was never in a holier frame than when I gazed on that untroubled image of divine rest. I instinctively echoed the words she had uttered a few hours before. Incomparably beyond and above us all, whether still on earth or now in heaven, her spirit is at home with God. I don't know if it would be a particularity of mine, but I am seldom otherwise than happy while watching in the chamber of death, should no frenzied or sparing mourner share the duty with me. I see a repose that neither earth nor hell can break, and I feel an assurance of the endless and shadowless hereafter, eternity they have entered, where life is boundless in its duration, and love is in its sympathy, and joy in its fullness. I notice on the occasion how much selfishness there is even in a love like Mr. Linton's, where he so regretted Catherine's blessed release. To be sure, one might have doubted, after the wayward and impatient existence she had led, and others she merited a haven of peace at last. One might doubt in season of cold reflection, but not in the presence of her corpse, and assertion its own tranquillity, which seemed to pledge of equal quiet to its former inhabitants. Do you believe such people are happy in the other world, sir? I'd give a great deal to know. I decline answering Mrs. Dean's question, which struck me as somewhat heterodox. She proceeded. Retracing the course of Catherine Linton, I fear we have no right to think she is, but will leave her with her Maker. The master looked asleep, and I ventured soon after sunrise to quit the room and steal out the pure freshening air. The servants thought me gone to shake off the drowsiness of my protracted watch. In reality, my chief motive was seeking Mr. Heathcliff. He had remained among the larches all night. He would have heard nothing of the stir at the Grange, unless perhaps he might catch the gallop of the messenger going to Glimmerton. If he had come nearer, he would have probably be aware of the lights flitting to and fro in the opening and shutting of the outer doors, that all was not right within. I wished, yet feared to find him. I felt the terrible news must be told, and I longed to get it over, but how to do it I did not know. He was there, at least a few yards further in the park, leant against an ash tree, his hat off, and his hair soaked with the dew that had gathered on the budded branches and fell pattering around him. He had been standing a long time in that position, for I saw a pair of owls passing or repassing, scarcely 3 feet from him, busy in building their nest, and regarding in proximity no more than half a piece of timber. They flew off at my approach, and he raised his eyes and spoke. "She's dead," he said. "I'm not waiting for you to learn that. Put your handkerchief away. Don't snivel before me. Damn you all. She wants none of your tears." I was weeping as much for her as for him as her. We do sometimes pity creatures that have none of the feelings either for themselves or others, and when I first looked into his face, I perceived that he had got intelligence of the catastrophe, and a full notion struck me that his heart was quelled, and he prayed because his lips moved, and his gaze was bent on the ground. Yet she's dead, I answered, checking my sobs and drying my cheeks. Gone to heaven, I hope, where we may everyone join her in the due warning, and leave our evil ways to follow good. Did she take due warning then? Asked Heathcliff, attempting a sneer. Did she die like a saint? Come, give me a true history of the event. How did he endeavored to pronounce the name, but could not manage it, and compressing his mouth, he held a silent combat with its inward agony, defying meanwhile my sympathy with an unflinching, ferocious stare. How did she die? He resumed at last, fain, notwithstanding his hardihood, to have a support behind him, for after the struggle he trembled in spite of himself to his very finger ends. Poor wretch, I thought, you have a heart and nerves the same as your brother men. Why should you be so anxious to conceal them? Your pride cannot blind God. You tempt him to wring them till he forces a cry of humiliation. Quietly as a lamb, I answered aloud. She drew a sigh and stretched herself like a child reviving and sinking again to sleep. In 5 minutes after, I felt one little pulse at her heart and nothing more. And did she ever mention me? He asked, hesitating, as if he dreaded the answer to the question, which introduced details that he could not bear to hear. Her senses never returned. She recognized nobody from the time you left her, I said. She lies to the sweet smile on her face, and the latest ideas won her back to her pleasant early days. Her life closed in a gentle dream. May she wake as kindly as in the other world. May she wake in torment, he cried, with frightful vehemence, stamping his foot and groaning a sudden paroxysm of ungovernable passion. Why, she's a liar to the end. Where is she? Not there, not in heaven, not perished. Where? Oh, you said you cared nothing for my suffering, and I pray one prayer. I repeat it till my tongue stiffens. Catherine Earnshaw, may you not rest as long as I am living. You said I killed you. Haunt me then. You say I kill you. Haunt me then. The murdered do haunt their murderers. I believe, I know that ghosts have wandered on earth. Be with me always. Take any form, drive me mad, and only do not leave me in this abyss where I cannot find you. O God, it is unutterable. I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul. He dashed his head against the knotted trunk and lifted up his eyes, howling not like a man but a savage beast, getting goaded to death with knives and spears. I observed several slashes of blood about the bark on the tree, and his hand and forehead were both stained. Probably the scene I witnessed was a repetition of others acted during the night. I hardly moved my compassion, and it appalled me. Still, I felt reluctant to quiet him so, but the moment he recollected himself enough to notice me watching, he thundered a command for me to go, and I obeyed. He was beyond my skill to quiet or console. Mrs. Linton's funeral was appointed to take place on the Friday following her decease. Until then, her coffin remained uncovered and strewn with flowers and scented leaves in the great drawing room. Linton spent his days and nights there, a sleepless guardian, and a circumstance concealed for all but me. Heathcliff spent his nights at least outside, equally a stranger to repose. I held no communication with him. Still I was conscious of his design to enter, if he could, and on the Tuesday, a little after dark, while my master, from sheer fatigue, had been compelled to retire a couple of hours, I went and opened one of the windows, moved my perseverance to give him a chance of bestowing on his fading image of the idol one final adieu. He did not omit to avail himself to the opportunity, cautiously and briefly, too cautiously, to betray his presence by the slightest noise. Indeed, I shouldn't have discovered that he had been there, except for the disarrangement of the drapery about the corpse's face, and for observing on the floor a curl of light hair fastened in a silver thread, which, on examination, I ascertained to have been taken from the locket hung around Catherine's neck. Heathcliff had opened the trinket and cast out its contents, replacing them by a black lock of his own. I twisted the two and closed them together. Mr. Earnshaw was, of course, invited to attend the remains of his sister to the grave, and he sent no excuse, but he never came. So that, besides her husband, the mourners were wholly composed of tenants and servants. Isabella was not asked. The place of Catherine's interment, to be surprised of the villagers. The surprise of the villagers was neither in the chapel, under the carved monuments of the Lintons, nor yet by the tombs of her own relations outside. It was dug on a green slope in a courtyard of the kirkyard. where the wall is so low the heath and bilberry plants have climbed over it from the moor, and peat mold almost buries it. Her husband lies in the same spot now, and they have each a simple headstone above and a plain gray block at their feet to mark the graves. Chapter 3. That is on the back, by the way. May you not rest as long as I am living. You said I killed you. Haunt me then. That Friday made the last of our fine days for a month. In the evening the weather broke, the wind shifted from south to northeast and brought rain first and then sleet and snow. On the morrow one could hardly imagine that there had been 3 weeks of summer. The primroses and crocuses were hidden under wintry drifts, and larks were silent. The young leaves of the early trees smitten and blackened, and dreary and chill and dismal that morrow did creep over. And master kept his room. I took possession of the lonely parlor, converting it into a nursery, and there I was sitting, with the moaning doll of a child laid on my knee, rocking it to and fro, and watching. Meanwhile, the still driving flakes built up on the uncurtained window when the door opened, and some person entered, out of breath and laughing. My anger was greater than the astonishment. For a minute I suppose it one of the maids, and I cried, "Have done! How dare you show your giddiness here? What would Mr. Linton say if he heard you?" "Excuse me," answered a familiar voice, "but I know Edgar is in bed, and I cannot stop myself." With that the speaker came forward to the fire, panting and holding her hand to her side. "I have run the whole way away from Wuthering Heights," she continued after a pause. "Except where I've flown, I can't count the number of falls I've had. Oh, I'm aching all over. Don't be alarmed. There shall be an explanation as soon as I can give it. Only just have the goodness to step out and order the carriage to take me on to Glimmerton, and tell a servant to seek up a few clothes in my wardrobe." The intruder was Mrs. Heathcliff. She certainly seemed in no laughing predicament. Her hair streamed on her shoulders, dripping with snow and water. She was dressed in the girlish dress which commonly wore, befitting her age more than her position, a low frock with short sleeves and nothing on either head or neck. The frock was the light silk and clung to her with wet, and her feet were protected merely by thin slippers. Add to this a deep cut under one ear, which was cold prevented from bleeding profusely, a white face scratched and bruised, and a frame hardly able to support itself through fatigue, and you may fancy the first fright was not much allayed when I had leisure to examine her. "My dear young lady," I exclaimed, "I'll stir nowhere and hear nothing till you have removed every article of your clothing and put on things to dry. You certainly not go to Glimmerton tonight, so it is needless to order the carriage." "Certainly I shall," she said, "walking or riding, yet I have no objection to dress myself decently, and see how it flows down my neck now. The fire doesn't make it smart. She insisted on my fulfilling her directions. Before she would let me touch her, and not till the coachman had been instructed to get ready, and a maid set to pack up the necessary attire, did I obtain her consent for binding the wound and helping to change the garments. "Now, Ellen," she said, when my task was finished, and she was seated in an easy chair on the hearth, with the cup of tea before her, "you sit down opposite me and put poor Catherine's baby away. I don't like to see it. You mustn't think I care little for Catherine because I behaved so foolishly on entering. I have cried too bitterly, yes, more than any other one has have reason to cry. We parted unreconciled, you remember, and I shan't forgive myself, but for all that, I was not going to sympathize with him myself. For all that, I was not going to sympathize with him, the brute beast. Oh, give me the poker. This is the last thing of his I have about me." She slipped the gold ring from her third finger and threw it to the floor. "I'll smash it," she continued, striking the childish spite, "and then I'll burn it." And she took and dropped the misused article among the coals. "There, he shall buy another if he gets me back again. He'll be capable of coming to seek me to tease Edgar. I dare not say lest that notion should possess his wicked head, and besides, Edgar has not been kind, has he? And I won't come suing for his assistance, nor will I bring him into more trouble. Necessity compelled me to seek shelter here, though if I had not learnt he was out of the way, I'd have halted at the kitchen, washed my face, warmed myself, and you to bring what I wanted, and departed again to anywhere out of the reach of my accursed or of that incarnate goblin. Ah, he was such in a fury if he had caught me. It's a pity Earnshaw's not his match in strength. I wouldn't have run till I'd seen him all but demolish, had Hindley been able to do it. Well, don't talk so fast, miss, I interrupted. You'll disorder the handkerchief I have tied around his neck, and make the cut bleed again. Drink your tea, and take your breath, and give over laughter. Laughter is sadly out of place under this roof, and in your condition an undeniable truth, she replied. Listen to the child. It maintains a constant wail. Send it out of the hearing for an hour. It shan't stay any longer. I rang the doorbell and committed to servant's care, and then I inquired what she urged her to escape from Wuthering Heights in such an unlikely plight, and where she meant to go, as she refused remaining with us. I ought and I wish to remain, answered she, to cheer Edgar and take care of the baby, for two things, and because the Grange is my home. But I tell you, you wouldn't let me. Do you think you could bear to see me grow fat and merry, and poisoning our comfort? Now I'll have the satisfaction of being sure that he detests me to the point of its annoyance. Will him seriously to have him within earshot or eyesight. I notice when I enter his presence, the muscles in his countenance are involuntarily distorted into an expression of hatred, partly arising from his knowledge of the good causes I have to feel the sentiment for him, and partly for original aversion. It is strong enough to make me feel pretty certain that he would not chase me over England, supposing I contrived a clear escape, and therefore I must get quite away. I have recovered for him my first desire to be killed by him. I'd rather he'd kill himself. He has extinguished my love effectually, and so I'm at my ease. I can recollect yet, though I loved him, and can dimly imagine what I could still be loving him, if no, even if he had doted on me, the childish nature would have revealed his existence somehow. Catherine had an awful perverted taste to esteem him dearly, knowing him so well. Monster, what would he be blotted out of creation? What, that he could be blotted out of creation, out of memory? Would that he could be blotted out of creation, out of memory. Hush, hush, he's a human being, I said. Be more charitable. There are worse men than he is. Yet he's not a human being, she retorted, and he had no claim on my charity. I gave him my heart, and he took and pinched it to death and flung it back to me. When people feel with their hearts, Ellen, and since he destroyed mine, I have no power to feel for him, and I would not, though he groaned from this to his dying day, and wept tears of blood for Catherine. No, indeed, I wouldn't. And here Isabella began to cry, but immediately dashing the water from her lashes, she recommenced. You ask what has driven me to flight at last. I was compelled to attempt it, because I had succeeded in rousing his rage a pitch above his malignity. Pulling out the nerves with red-hot pincers requires more coolness than knocking on the head. He was worked up to forget the fiendish prudence he boasted of, and proceeded of murderous violence. I experienced pleasure in being able to exasperate him. The sense of pleasure woke my instinct of self-preservation, so I fairly broke free, and if ever I come into hands again, he is a welcome to a signal revenge. Yesterday, Mr. Earnshaw should have been at the funeral. He kept himself sober for the purpose, tolerably sober, not going to bed mad at 6 o'clock and getting up drunk at 12. Consequently, he rose in suicidal low spirits, as fit for the church as for a dance, and instead he sat there down by the fire and swallowed gin and brandy by tumblerfuls. Heathcliff, I shudder to name him, has been a stranger in the house from last Sunday till today. Whether the angels have fed him or his kin beneath him, I cannot tell, but he has not eaten a meal with us for nearly a week. He has just come home at dawn. He gone upstairs to his chamber, locked himself in, as if anybody could dream of coveting his company. There he is senseless. There he has continued, praying like a Methodist. Only the deity he implored is senseless dust to ashes, and God, when addressed, was curiously confounded by his own black feather, and concluding these precious orisons, and they lasted generally until he grew hoarse, and his breath was straight in his throat. He would be off again, always straight down to the Grange. I wonder Edgar did not send for a constable and give him into custody. For me, grieved as I was about Catherine, it was impossible to avoid regarding the season of deliverance for degrading oppression as a holiday. I recovered spirits sufficient to hear Joseph's eternal lectures without weeping, and to move up and down the house less with the foot of the frightened thief than formerly. You wouldn't think that I should cry at anything Joseph could say, but he and Hareton are detestable companions. I'd rather sit with Hindley and hear his awful talk with the little master and his staunch supporter, than odious little men. That odious little man. When Heathcliff is in, I've often obliged to seek the kitchen in the society of starve among the damp, uninhabited chambers. When he is not, as was the case last week, I establish a table and chair at one corner of the house fire, and never mind how Mr. Earnshaw can occupy himself, and he does not interrupt with my arrangement. He is quieter now than he used to be. If no one provokes him, more sullen and depressed and less furious. Joseph affirms that he is an altered man, that the Lord has touched his heart, and he is saved. So as by fire, I'm puzzled to detect signs of the favourable change, but it is not my business. Yester evening, I sat in my nook reading some old books till late on toward 12. I seemed so dismal to go upstairs with the wind snowing, blowing outside, and my thoughts continually reverting back to Kirkyard and the new grave. I dared hardly lift my eye from the page before me. The melancholy scene was so instantly usurped its place. Hindley sat opposite, his head leant on the hand, perhaps meditating on the same subject he had ceased drinking at a point below irrationality, and had neither stirred nor spoken during 2 or 3 hours. There was no sound through the house but the moaning wind, which took the windows every now and then, the faint crackling of the coals, and the click of my snuffers as I removed at intervals the long wick of the candle. Hareton and Joseph were probably fast asleep in bed. It was very, very sad, and while I read I sighed, for it seemed as if all joy had vanished from the world, never to be restored. The doleful silence was broken at last by the sound of the kitchen latch, and Heathcliff had returned from his watch earlier than usual, owing, I suppose, to the sudden storm. That entrance was fastened, and we heard him coming round to get in by the other. I rose with an irrepressible expression of what I felt on my lips, which induced my companion, who had been staring toward the door, to turn and look at me. I kept him out 5 minutes. I'll keep him up 5 minutes, he exclaimed. You won't object? No. You may do with him the whole night for me, I answered. Do put the key in the lock and draw the bolts. Earnshaw accomplished this ere his guest reached the front. He then came and brought the chair to the other side of the table, leaning forward over it, and searching in my eyes of sympathy with the burning hate that gleamed from his, as he both looked and felt like an assassin. He couldn't exactly find that, but he discovered enough to encourage him to speak. You and I, he said, we have a great deal of debt to settle with the man out yonder. If we were neither of us cowards, we might combine to discharge it. Are you as soft as your brother? Are you willing to endure to the last, and not once attempt a repayment? I am weary of enduring it now, and I'll be glad of the retaliation that wouldn't recoil on myself. But treachery and violence are spears pointed at both ends. They would those who resort to them worse than their enemies. Treachery and violence are a just return for treachery and violence, cried Hindley. And Mrs. Heathcliff, I'll ask you to do nothing but sit still and be dumb. Now tell me, can you? I am sure you would have as much pleasure as I in witnessing the conclusion of your fiend's existence. He'll be your death unless you overreach him, and he'll be my ruin. Damn the hellish villain. He knocked at the door, and if he were master were here already. Promised to hold your tongue, and before the clock strikes, it wants 3 minutes of 1. You're a free woman. He took the implements which I described to you in my letter with his breast, and would have turned down the candle. I snatched it away, however, and seized his arm. I'll not hold my tongue. You mustn't touch me. Let the door remain shut and be quiet. No, I form my resolution, and my God will execute it, cried the desperate being. I'll do you a kindness in spite of yourself, inherent justice, and you needn't trouble your head to screen me. Catherine is gone. Nobody alive would regret me or be ashamed, though I cut my throat is mine this minute, and it's time to make an end. I thought as well I had struggled with the bear, or reasoned with a lunatic. The only resource that left me to run it to a lattice, and Lord, his intended victim of the fate was waiting him. You'd better seek shelter somewhere else tonight, I exclaimed in a rather triumphant tone. Mr. Earnshaw has a mind to shoot you if you persist in endeavoring to enter. You'd better open the door, he answered, addressing me by some elegant term that I don't care to repeat. I shall not meddle in the matter, I retorted again. Come in and get shot, if you please. I have done my duty. With that, I shut the window and returned to the place by the fire, having too small a stock of hypocrisy at my command to pretend any anxiety from the danger which menaced him. Earnshaw swore passionately at me, affirming that I loved the villain yet, and calling me all sorts of names of the base spirit I evinced, and I, in my secret heart and conscience, never approached me, thought that a blessing it would be for him should Heathcliff put him out of misery, and what a blessing for me should he send Heathcliff to his right abode. As I sat nursing these reflections, the casement behind me was banged on the floor by a blow from the latter individual, and his black countenance looked blightingly through. The stanchion stood too close to suffer his shoulders to follow, and I smiled, exulting in my fancied security. His hair and clothes were whitened with snow, and his sharp cannibal teeth, revealed by cold and wrath, gleamed through the dark. Isabella, let me in, or I'll make you repent, he gurned, as Joseph called it. I cannot commit murder, I replied. Mr. Hindley stands sentinel with a knife and loaded pistol. Let me in by the kitchen door, he said. Hindley will be there before me, I answered, and that's a poor love of yours that cannot bear a shower of snow. We were left at peace in our beds as long as the summer moon shone, but the moment a blast of winter returns, you must run for shelter. Heathcliff, if I were you, I'd go stretch myself over their grave and die for a faithful dog, and sure as the world is surely not worth living in now, is it? You had distinctly impressed on me the idea that Catherine was your whole joy in your life. I can't imagine anything surviving her loss. He's there, is he? Exclaimed my companion, rushing in the gap. If I can get my arm out, I can hit him. I'm afraid, Ellen, you'll set me down as really wicked, but you don't know all, so don't judge. I wouldn't have aided or abetted an attempt on his life for anything. Wish that he were dead I must, and therefore I was fearfully disappointed and unnerved by terror for the consequences of my taunting speech when he flung himself on Earnshaw's weapon and wrenched it from his grasp. The charge exploded, and the knife had sprang backward, closed on its owner's wrist. Heathcliff pulled it away by main force, slitting up the flesh as it passed, and thrust it dripping into his own pocket. But then took a stone, struck down the division between two windows, and sprung in. His adversary had fallen senseless with excessive pain, and the flow of blood that gushed from an artery of a large vein. The ruffian kicked and trampled on him, and dashed his head repeatedly against the flags, holding him with one hand, meaning to prevent me summoning Joseph. He exerted preterhuman self-denial in abstaining from finishing him completely, but getting out of breath, and finally desisted and dragged the apparently inanimate body onto the settle. There he tore off the sleeves of Earnshaw's coat and bound up the wound in brutal roughness, spitting and cursing during the operation as energetically as he had kicked before. Being a liberty, I had no time in seeking the old servant, who having gathered by degrees the purport of my hasty tale, that hurrying now, gasping as he descended the steps two at once. What is there to do now? There's this to do, thundered Heathcliff, that your master's mad, and should be last another month. I'll have him to an asylum. And how the devil did you come out fasten me out, you toothless hound? You'd stand muttering and mumbling there. Come, I'm not going to nurse him. Wash the stuff away, and mind the sparks of your candle. It is more than half brandy. And so I been muttering on him, explained Joseph, lifting his hands and eyes in horror. If I see a sight like this, may the Lord— Heathcliff gave him a push on his knees in the middle of the blood and flung a towel on him, but instead of proceeding to dry it up, he joined his head and began a prayer which excited my laughter in its old phraseology. I was in the condition of mind to be shocked at nothing. In fact, I was reckless, as some malefactors show themselves at the foot of the gallows. Oh, I forgot you, said the tyrant. You shall do that. Down with you, you conspire with him against me. Do you, viper? There, that is work fit for you. He shook me till my teeth rattled and pinched me beside Joseph, who steadily concluded his suspicions, and then rose, vowing he would set off the Grange directly. Mr. Linton was a magistrate, and though he had 50 wives dead, he should inquire into this. He was so obstinate in his resolution that Heathcliff deemed it expedient to compel from my lips a recapitulation of what had taken place, standing over me and heaving with malevolence as I reluctantly delivered the account in an answer to his question. It required a great deal of labor to satisfy the old man that he was not an aggressor, especially with the hardly wrung replies. However, Mr. Earnshaw soon convinced him that he was still alive. He hastened to administer a dose of spirit, and by the succor, his master presently regained the motion and consciousness. Heathcliff, aware that he was ignorant to the treatment received while insensible, called him deliriously intoxicated, and said he should not notice his atrocious conduct further, but advised him to get to bed, to my joy, and left us after giving the judicious counsel, and Hindley stretched himself on the hearthstone. I departed to my own room, marveling that I had escaped so easily. This morning, when I came down about half an hour before noon, Mr. Earnshaw was sitting by the fire, deadly sick, his evil genius, almost as gaunt and ghastly, leant against the chimney. Neither appeared inclined to divine, and having waited till all was cold on the table, I commenced alone. Nothing hindered me from eating heartily. I experienced a certain sense of satisfaction and superiority, as at intervals I cast a look downward my silent companions, and felt the comfort of a quiet conscience within me. As I had done, I ventured on the unusual library of drawing near the fire, going round Earnshaw's seat, and kneeling in the corner beside him. Heathcliff did not glance my way, and I gazed up and contemplated his features almost as confidently as if they had been turned to stone. His forehead, that I once thought so manly, could now, and that now I think so diabolical, was shaded with a heavy cloud. The basilisk eyes were nearly quenched by sleeplessness, and weeping perhaps, for the lashes were wet then. His lips, devoid of their ferocious sneer, and sealed in an expression of unspeakable sadness. Had it been another, I would have covered my face in the presence of such grief. In his case, I was gratified, and ignoble as it seems to consult a fallen enemy, I couldn't miss the chance of striking in a dart. His weakness was the only time when I could taste the delight of paying wrong for wrong. Fie, miss, I interrupted. One might suppose you had never opened a Bible in your life. If God afflicted your enemies, surely that ought to suffice you. It is both mean and presumptuous to add your torture to his. In general, I'll allow it would be Ellen, she continued, but what misery laid on Heathcliff could content me unless I had a hand in it. I'd rather he suffered less, if I might cause a suffering, and he might know that I was the cause. Oh, I owe him so much. On only one condition can I hope to forgive him. It is, if I may take an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, for every wretch of agony, return a wretch, reduce himself to my level, as he was the first to injure, make him the first to implore pardon, and when, why then, Ellen, I might show you some generosity, but it is utterly impossible I can ever be revenged, and therefore I cannot forgive him. Hindley wanted some water, and I handed him a glass and asked him how he was. Not as ill as I wished, he replied, but leaving out my arm, every inch of me is as sore as I had been fighting with a legion of imps. Yes, no wonder, was my next remark. Catherine used to boast that she stood between you and bodily harm. She meant that certain persons would not hurt you for fear of offending her. It's well people don't really rise from their grave, or last night she might have witnessed a repulsive scene. Are you not bruised and cut over your chest and shoulders? I cannot say, he answered. But what do you mean? Did he dare to strike me when I was down? He trampled on and kicked you and dashed you on the ground, I whispered, and his mouth watered to tear you to teeth, because he's only half a man, not so much. Mr. Earnshaw looked up, like me, to the countenance of our mutual foe, who, absorbed in his anguish, seemed insensible to anything around him. The longer he stood, the plainer his reflections revealed the blackness throughout his features. Oh, if God would but give me strength to strangle him in my last agony, I'd go to hell with joy, groaned the impatient man, writhing to sense and sinking back in despair, convinced of the inadequacy for the struggle. Nay, it's enough that he has murdered one of you, I observed aloud at the Grange. Everyone knows your sister would have been living now, and it had not been for Heathcliff. After all, it is preferable to be hated than loved by him. When I recollect how happy we were, how happy Catherine was before he came, I'm fit to curse the day. Most likely Heathcliff noticed more the truth of what was said than the spirit of the person who said it. His attention was roused, I saw, for his eyes rained down tears among the ashes, and he drew his breath, his suffocating sighs. I stared full at him, then laughed scornfully. The clouded window of hell flashed a moment towards me. The fiend, which usually looked out, however, was so dimmed and drowned that I did not fear to hazard another sound of derision. Get up and be gone out of my sight, said the murderer. I guessed the uttered words, at least through his voice, was hardly intelligible. I beg your pardon, I replied, but I love Catherine too, and the brother requires attention, which, for her sake, I shall supply. Now that she's dead, I see her in Hindley. Hindley is exactly her eyes, if he has not tried to gouge them out and make them black and red and hurt. Get up, you wretched idiot, before I stamp you to death, he cried, making a movement that caused me to make one also. But then, I continued, holding myself ready to flee, if poor Catherine had trusted you and assumed the ridiculous, contemptible, degrading title of Mrs. Heathcliff, she would soon have presented a similar picture. She wouldn't have borne your abominable behavior quietly. Her detestation and disgust must have found voice. The back of the saddle and Earnshaw's person interposed between me and him, so instead of endeavoring to reach me, he snatched a dinner knife from the table and flung it at my head. It struck beneath my ear and stopped the sentence I was uttering, and pulling it out, I sprang to the door and delivered another, which I hope went a little deeper than his missile. The last glimpse I caught of him was a furious rush on his part, checked by the embrace of the host, and both fell locked together on the hearth. In my flight through the kitchen, I bid Joseph speed to his master. I knocked over Hareton, who was hanging a litter of puppies from a chair back on the doorway, and blessed as a soul escaped from purgatory, I bound, leaped, and flew down the steep road, and then quitting its windings, shot direct across the moor, rolling over banks and wading through marshes, precipitating myself, in fact, towards the beacon light of the Grange, and far rather would I be condemned to a perpetual dwelling in the infernal regions than even for one night abide beneath the roof of Wuthering Heights again. Isabella ceased speaking and took a drink of tea. Then she rose, and bidding me put on her bonnet and a great shawl I had brought, and turning a deaf ear to my entreaties for her to remain another hour, she stepped into the chair, kissed Edgar and Catherine's portraits, bestowed a similar salute on me, and descended to the carriage, accompanied by Fanny, who yelped wild with joy and recovering our mistress. She was driven away, never to revisit this neighborhood, but a regular correspondence was established between her and my master when things were more settled. I believe her new abode was in the south, near London. There she had a son born a few months subsequent to her escape. He was christened Linton, and from the first she reported him to be an ailing, peevish creature. Mr. Heathcliff, meeting me one day in the village, inquired where she lived. I refused to tell. He remarked that it was not for any moment one she must beware of becoming to her bother. She should not be with him if he had to keep her himself. Though I would give no information he discovered, through some of the other servants, both her place of residence and the existence of the child. Still, he didn't molest her, for which forbearance she might think her aversion, I suppose. He often asked about the infant when she saw me, and on hearing his name smiled grimly, and observed, "They wish me to hate it too, do they?" "I don't think they wish you to know anything about it," I answered, "but I'll have it," he said, "when I want it. They may reckon on that." Fortunately, his mother died before the time arrived, some 13 years after the decease of Catherine, and Linton was 12 or a little more. On the day succeeding Isabella's unexpected visit, I had no opportunity of speaking to my master. He stunned conversation, and was fit to discuss nothing when I could get him to listen. I saw it pleased him that his sister had left her husband, with whom he abhorred, with an intensity which the mildness of his nature would scarcely seem to allow. So deep and sensitive was his aversion that he refrained from going anywhere where he was likely to go or to see or hear of Heathcliff. Grief and that together transformed him into a complete hermit. He threw up his office to magistrate, ceased even to attend church, avoided the village of all occasions, and spent a life of entire seclusion within the limits of the park and grounds, only varied by solitary rambles on the moors and visits to the grave of his wife, mostly at evenings or early morning before other wanderers were abroad. But he was too good to be thoroughly unhappy long. He didn't pray for Catherine's soul to haunt him. Time brought resignation and a melancholy sweeter than common joy. He recalled her memory with ardent, tender love, and hopeful and aspiring to the better world, where he doubted not she was gone, and he had earthly consolation and affection also. For a few days, I said, he seemed regardless of the puny successor to the departed. The coldness melted as fast as snow in April, and ere the tiny thing could stammer a word or totter a step, it wielded a despot scepter in his heart. It was named Catherine, but he never called it the name in full, as he had never called the first Catherine short, probably because Heathcliff had a habit of doing so. The little one was always Cathy. It formed to him a distinction from her mother, and yet a connection with her, and his attachment sprang from his relation to her far more than from its being his own. I used to draw a comparison between him and Hindley Earnshaw, and perplexed myself to explain satisfactorily why their conduct was so opposite in similar circumstances. They had both been fond husbands, and were both attracted to their children, and I could see how they shouldn't have been taking the same road for good or evil. But I thought in my mind, Hindley, with apparently the stronger head, has shown himself sadly the worse and the weaker man. When his ship struck, the captain abandoned his post, and the crew, instead of trying to save her, rushed into riot and confusion without no hope for the luckless vessel. Linton, on the contrary, displayed the true courage of a loyal and faithful soul. He trusted God, and God comforted him. One hoped, and for the other despaired. They chose their own lots, and are righteously doomed to endure them. But you'll not want to hear my moralizing, Mr. Lockwood. You'll judge as well as I can at all these things. At least you'll think you will, and that's the same. The end of Earnshaw was what might have been expected. It followed fast on his sisters. There were scarcely 6 months between them. We at the Grange never got a very succinct amount of the state preceding it. All that I did learn was on occasion of going to aid on the preparation for the funeral. Mr. Kenneth came to announce the evening to my master. "Well, Nelly," said he, riding on the yard one morning too early not to alarm me with an instant presentiment of bad news, "it's your turn and my turn to go into mourning at present. Who's given us the slip now, do you think?" "Who?" I asked in a flurry. "Why, yes," he returned, dismounting and slinging his bridle on a hook by the door. "A nip of the corner of your apron. I'm certain you'll need it." "Not Mr. Heathcliff, surely," I exclaimed. "What? Would you have tears for him?" said the doctor. "No, Heathcliff's a tough young fellow. He looked blooming today. I've just seen him. He's rapidly regaining flesh since he lost his better half." "Who is it then, Mr. Kenneth?" I repeated impatiently. "Hindley Earnshaw, your old friend Hindley," he replied, "and my wicked gossip, though he's been too wild for me this long while. There, I said we should draw water, but cheer up, he died true to his character, drunk as a lord, poor lad. I'm sorry, too." One can't help missing an old companion, though he had the worst tricks with him that ever man imagined, and has done me many a rascally turn. He's barely 27, it seems, with your own age. Who would have thought you were born in 1 year? I confess this blow was greater to me than the shock of Mrs. Linton's death. Ancient associations lingered around my heart. I sat down on the porch and wept as for the blood relation, desiring Kenneth to get another servant to introduce him to the master. I could not hinder myself from pondering on the question, had he had fair play? Whatever I did, the idea would bother me if it was so tiresomely pertinacious that I resolved on requesting leave to go to Wuthering Heights and assist in the last duties of the dead. Mr. Linton was extremely reluctant to consent, but I pleaded eloquently for the friendless condition in which we lay, and I said my old master and foster brother had a claim on my service, and as strong as my own. Besides, I reminded him as the child Hareton was his wife's nephew. and in the absence of nearer kin, he ought to act as guardian, and he ought to and must inquire if the property was left, and look over the concerns of his brother-in-law. He was unfit for attending in such matters then, but he bid me speak to the lawyer, and at length permitted me to go. His lawyer had been Earnshaw also. I called at the village and asked him to accompany me. He shook his head and advised that Heathcliff should be left alone, affirming if the truth were known, Hurton would be found little else than a beggar. His father died in debt, he said. The whole property is mortgaged, and the sole chance the natural heir is to allow him an opportunity of creating some interest in the creditor's heart, that he may be inclined to deal leniently toward him. When I reached the Heights, I explained that I had come to see everything carried on decently, and Joseph, who appeared in sufficient distress, expressed satisfactorily at my presence. Mr. Heathcliff had said he did not perceive that I was wanted, but I might stay and order the arrangements for the funeral if I choose. Correctly, he remarked, that fool's body should be buried at the crossroads without ceremony of any kind. I happened to leave him 10 minutes yesterday afternoon, and in that interval he fastened the 2 doors on the house against me, and he was spent the night in drinking himself to death deliberately. We broke in this morning, and we heard the snoring like a horse, and there he was, laid over his settle, flaying and scalping, would not have waked him. I sent for Kenneth, and he came, but not till the beast had changed into carrion. He was both dark and cold and stark, and so you'll allow it was useless making more stir about him. The old servant confirmed the statement, but muttered, I would rather ye had gone and sent for the doctor. I said intent to master better than him. Now ye weren't dead and all left. Now it's the swart. I insisted on the funeral being respectful. Mr. Heathcliff said I might have my own way if I were there too. Only he desired me to remember that the money for the whole affair came out of his pocket. He maintained a careless deportment, indicative of neither joy nor sorrow. If anything, it expressed a flinty gratification at a piece of difficult work successfully executed. I observed once, indeed, something like exultation in his aspect. It was just when the people were bearing the coffin from the house. He had the hypocrisy to represent a mourner, and previous to following with Hareton, he lifted the unfortunate child on the table and muttered with peculiar gusto, "Now, my bonny lad, you are mine, and we'll see if one tree won't grow as crooked as another with the same wind to twist it." The unsuspecting thing was pleased at his speech. He played with Heathcliff's whiskers and stroked his cheek, and I divined its meaning and observed tartly, "That boy must go back to Thrush's Grange, sir. There's nothing in the world less yours than he is." Does Linton say so? He demanded. "Of course he has ordered me to take him," I replied. "Well," said the scoundrel, "we'll not argue the subject now, but I have a fancy to try my hand at rearing a young one, so intimate to your master that I must supply the place of his with my own. If he attempt to remove it, I don't engage to let Hareton go undisputed, but I'll be pretty sure to make the other come. Remember to tell him." This hint was enough to bind our hands. I repeated its substance on my return, and Edgar Linton, little interested at the commencement, spoke no further of interfering. I'm not aware that he could have done it to any purpose, had he been ever so willing. The guest was now the master of Wuthering Heights. He held firm possession and proved to the attorney, who in his turn proved to Mr. Linton, that Earnshaw had mortgaged every yard of land he owned for cash to supply his mania for gaming, and he, Heathcliff, was the mortgagee. In the manner, Hareton, who should now be the first gentleman in the neighbourhood, was reduced to a state of complete dependence on his father's inveterate enemy, and lives in his own house as a servant, deprived of the advantages of wages, and quite unable to right himself because of his friendlessness and his ignorance that he had been wronged. Chapter 4 for tomorrow. A lot of death today. Thank you for listening.